Begin now.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for all of you for joining us. I'm Ray Offenheiser. I am the director of the Pulte Institute for Global Development here at the University of Notre Dame. As an integral part of Notre Dame's Keough School for Global Affairs, the Pulte Institute addresses poverty and inequality through policy, practice, and partnership. On behalf of the entire Pulte Institute team, I'm delighted to welcome you to our new Think ND program entitled Conversations on Poverty and Inequality. The Pulte Institute has joined forces with the McKenna Center for Human Development and Global Business to bring you an exciting discussion on our first theme, the power of social entrepreneurship. It's our hope that over the course of the next 3 weeks that we build a vital community and connect with people globally to reflect upon the material presented. We're excited and humbled by the amount of interest in this program, as this morning we have over 300 participants from over 40 countries registered to join through the course of the program. This series is intended to be insightful, engaging, and we do hope that you'll stay with us, connected not only to us here at the Pulte Institute, but to the global community we build over the course of these next 3 weeks. Our topic for this week is the transformative power of social entrepreneurship. And today we're going to be exploring the concept of social entrepreneurship, why it is gaining popularity in some communities and sparking controversy in others. We'll see some unique examples of how social entrepreneurs are changing the world and what Notre Dame is actually doing to foster this mindset within its students. We're going to have a 15-minute breakout session at the end of the event so that if you have time and you wish to join our speakers, you can continue to meet each other and to discuss today's topic in smaller groups. Here at the beginning, we'd like to ask that if you have questions for our presenters, please use the Google form that we're sharing with you right now through chat. So check the chat at the bottom of the screen. You'll see it coming up now. This will allow us to facilitate questions as effectively as possible. And we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible given the time constraints. Without further ado, I want to begin the program this morning. I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues, Melissa Paulsen and Michael Morris, both professors of the practice within the Keough School of Global Affairs. Melissa has vast experience teaching social entrepreneurship and working within the private sector on global development needs throughout her role as director of the Pulte Institute's Entrepreneurship and Education Division. Similarly, Mike has dedicated his entire career to bringing entrepreneurship empowerment to those operating under conditions of adversity. His commitment is reflected through his research, his teaching, and community engagement efforts through the McKenna Center and for several decades prior to joining the faculty here at the University of Notre Dame and the Keough School. I'd like to thank Mike, Melissa, Mary Scott, and the team here at the Notre Dame Alumni Association for lending their time and talents to bring this program to life. It's now my pleasure to turn the program and the mic over to Melissa, who will get us started.
Thanks very much, Ray, and hello to everyone. I wanted to start off with a few questions actually for Mike. So before we talk about social entrepreneurship, can you tell us a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about entrepreneurship?
Well, good morning, Melissa. Yes. When we think about entrepreneurship, when most people think about entrepreneurship, they think about creating a business. There are other perspectives. Harvard has a famous approach, a definition, pursuing opportunity regardless of the resources that you control. Our approach here at Notre Dame is to think of entrepreneurship as a process of creating value by combining resources in unique ways to capitalize on opportunity. The key here is that it's not just about dreaming, it's about doing. And so it's about overcoming the challenges, overcoming the obstacles, bringing people along. It's about implementation.
That's great, Mike. So if that's entrepreneurship, what exactly is social entrepreneurship?
Well, the foundation is the same. As we'll see in the coming discussion, there are big differences. But if we build on what I said a moment ago, we define social entrepreneurship as the process of creating social value, again through unique resource combinations, but in this case to address social problems and needs. Melissa, this definition has some important underlying components. And the key in the next slide is that the approach is a process. By thinking of social entrepreneurship as a process, we accept that it's you can break it down into steps. It's learnable, it's manageable. It can be applied in lots of different contexts, as we'll see in the next few moments. Also, that definition is that it's about innovative, non-traditional approaches to environmental degradation, to poverty, to animal abuse. At the same time, if you think about that definition, it doesn't mean you have to create an organization. It doesn't mean you have to have some sort of self-generating revenue model. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that scales.
So can you talk a little bit more about this process? We've got it outlined here on the screen, but when you talk to your students about this process, how do you explain it to them?
Yeah, so Melissa, both with students in our engagement in the community, in our research, we conceptualize this process in terms of 6 key steps or stages. And so it starts with recognizing a social need and putting some boundaries or parameters around the nature of that need that you intend to address. Developing a unique, innovative solution, an alternative approach, breaking with the way we've approached this issue in the past. It's about organizing, which might be creating some sort of entity. It might not, but some sort of platform from which to implement your social innovation. And then resourcing, not just financial resourcing, but a lot of other types of resources, people and equipment and so forth. Social value then has to be created from an implementation standpoint, operationally, and disseminated. Growth then is the challenge, and a key issue that we will elaborate on is okay, how do you evaluate what kind of impact that you're having through this process? So the picture we just looked at, Melissa, was linear, and the problem is nothing in reality it tends to be linear. It's a messy process. It's a chaotic process. There are feedback loops. As entrepreneurial activity, it's not controllable, it's not predictable. But the most important thing is when you try to do something in the social entrepreneurship realm, when you're trying to address an issue of a big social challenge, it's emergent. So what emerges in terms of your solution and your approach and what works usually is quite different from where you started.
Oh, can you give us some examples, perhaps? I think it might be helpful to make it a little bit more concrete.
Yeah, make it a little more concrete, but at the same time, show that it's a very diverse, wide open kind of area. So I'd certainly think Mother Teresa was a social entrepreneur when she created social value dealing with in the slums of Calcutta and ultimately across the globe. But then look at Tom's Shoes, where they have a model of sell a pair of shoes, give a pair of shoes to someone in need while making a profit. Or at a more personal level, you know, if you have somebody in Chicago, say, who comes up with a new math curriculum that when adopted by schools and because of her just tenacious efforts, results in significant math improvement performance by students from disadvantaged backgrounds, that's social entrepreneurship. If that same innovation was developed and disseminated by a private company or a university or a government agency, it still represents a form of social entrepreneurship. If you take something that maybe works on environmental sustainability in the Sahara Desert and figure out a way to use it in a lab setting, or that's social entrepreneurship. And then internally within a social cause organization, if you take Habitat for Humanity and they come up with a really novel alternative way to sustain themselves financially, there again, you have a form of social entrepreneurship.
So Mike, it sounds like all entrepreneurship might be considered social, or is it? What are the differences? Is this a kind of like, you know it when you see it type of thing?
Well, I think it's a little more explicit than that, but there are differences that are really important. So think about opportunity. Opportunity drives entrepreneurs, but it needs to be a big enough opportunity. You need to quantify. You need to evaluate the opportunity. In a social context, the problem is not opportunities. There's a lot of people in poverty. There's a lot of environmental degradation, and so you need to define the boundaries around what you're trying to do about the problem, but that's not the issue. The customer is often unclear. So who's the customer when you're trying to reduce pollution or you're trying to achieve equal pay for women? Competition exists, but it's typically not direct competition over what you're doing. It's competition for resources. The irony is if you do a better job and you serve more people, it doesn't mean you make more revenue. In fact, it could mean you lose more. You have more loss, financial loss. Your revenue models are more complicated because you're typically not generating a lot of revenue from selling a product or service, or often no revenue. And so it's a mix of grants and sponsorships and crowdfunding and donors. You don't have a profit mechanism. And the beauty of profit is it tells you you're making good decisions or bad decisions. That without that sort of signpost, you're making decisions without the sort of market feedback that helps you make adjustments. And you want to continually innovate, but that isn't the money and effort tied to innovation isn't tied to any kind of profit return. And so making those decisions is tough. There isn't a price mechanism most of the time that sort of quantifies how much value you're creating. And as we'll come back to a little later, quantifying success is tough.
Mm-hmm.
Traditional entrepreneurship, we think about, well, what's your exit strategy? Well, what's your exit strategy when you're trying to reduce poverty? Because that's it's not like on Tuesday next week, poverty's solved.
So if we're trying to solve these social problems, how do we, you mentioned earlier process, what's the entrepreneurial aspect of, when you're trying to solve these problems?
Yeah, that's such an important question, Melissa. So I think one way to think about it is, if it's social entrepreneurship, where's the entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, and where's the social and social entrepreneurship?
Right.
The entrepreneurship is not about necessarily creating an entity like a nonprofit. It's not about cleverly coming up with internally derived revenue sources, or it's not about just being more professional in your management approach. It's about the entrepreneurial mindset and how we bring that entrepreneurial mindset to our whole approach to social value creation. The social side is also important. It's not just that I'm addressing a social problem. It's the social processes, the social relationships, the social dynamics that I have to master and manage to solve social problems in innovative ways. And if we go to the next slide, please, if we think about this mindset, it's about being entrepreneurial in our solution, and how we deliver the solution, and how we run the organization, and how do we motivate employees and volunteers, and how we obtain resources. And to me, one of my favorite examples is we take a traditional nonprofit that became very entrepreneurial, the DC Soup Kitchen, where they had a director who very cleverly, first of all, started to source from high-end restaurants around DC in terms of the food that they would otherwise throw away. Then starts generating revenue by creating a catering company working out of the soup kitchen, where the staff that would cater these events, like a congressional event, would be formerly incarcerated people. And then trying to expand capacity, he starts forming relationships with middle schools and high schools that have unused kitchens many hours of the day and many months of the year, where he would provide culinary training to students, but then use those high school kitchens to produce more food to feed the hungry. And so it's this mindset that's the key, Melissa. So
Yeah,
let me ask you a few questions. Building on this foundation that we've sort of talked about here, it's clear that social entrepreneurship can take lots of different forms, and that can become kind of confusing. Is there some way to bring more order to it all?
Yeah, so you can see on this slide, I've presented something called the Social Entrepreneurship Continuum. So it's something that I use in my class with my students and with other in other workshops. And first, I'd like to kind of emphasize that we're talking about a problem that you're seeking a solution for. So the most important thing that I always share is problem first, solution, what's the best solution, and try to be agnostic of any entity formation until you've arrived at the best possible solution. And the entity formation may not be actually an entity. It could be a partnership with another organization that has the structure that can provide for this activity. I think one thing that I'd also like to dispel is the fact that a social entrepreneurial activity has to be in the form of a not-for-profit. Certainly, you've kind of emphasized that. You've talked about, it can take the form of a not-for-profit. It can take the form of a for-profit. And it can take the form of both. So in this slide, for those of you who are participating in the call, if you watch this TEDx talk with Jane Chen, she shared something about her Embrace Warmer that was created out of a class at Stanford. And when she started the organization, she formed a not-for-profit because she was trying to raise money to do the research to create the warmer. She ended up needing to raise $5 million to get the company up and running in India. And so she made the decision to actually move to a for-profit social enterprise, kept the not-for-profit as her research arm, but actually went to the for-profit. So this is just an example of how social entrepreneurship can take multiple forms. Now, a political lobbying organization isn't a social enterprise or a social entrepreneurial activity. I'm not saying that, it can, anything goes here, but it can take many forms across this spectrum. And what I like to tell my students is that when it gets messy, that's when social entrepreneurship is happening. You kind of move into this gray space, into the middle of this continuum, and that's a really great opportunity for social entrepreneurship to take place.
I think this continuum is really interesting, and it does start to bring a little structure or order to things, but maybe we could drill down a little bit. Could you, into these forms, could you give us a real world example of a community generated social entrepreneurship activity?
Yeah, so you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, the Black Church Food Security Network. And so basically this was created out of a problem that the community surrounding this church found. So this isn't exactly a problem that people don't know about. We have food insecurity issues across not just the US, but the globe, obviously. And when you have food insecurity, especially here in the US, you might be in a food desert. And so in food deserts, you might have access to food, but it's usually not very nutritious food. Or there might be a grocery store in the vicinity, but it's too expensive, or there might be transportation issues that make it difficult for a community to get access. And historically, Black churches are actually coming up with solutions to these problems. And one such church noticed that they had a significant amount of space, of ground, that the church was on, And they realized that this was an asset. And so the pastor of this church said, why don't we grow our own food? So kind of coming out of this problem and trying to address food insecurity in his community, in his parish, they determined that they would, grow food. And they started, the Reverend's name is Reverend Dr. Heber Brown, and they basically grew 1,000 pounds of food on their, church space. And what ended up happening is that other communities, other churches noticed, hey, you're feeding your community. We'd like to, do the same thing. And will you share your information about how to grow and all of these different things? And so Reverend Brown, started sharing, his community started sharing. And that was the, kind of the beginnings of this Black Church Food Security Network. And it's important, and I listened to a podcast with Dr. Brown, and he basically was very emphatic when he said, this isn't about kind of scaling big. It's really about a community, communities coming together. And he called it power over the plate, where the community would, develop food, kind of a farmer's market, and there would be entrepreneurial activities that would come out of that farmer's market. And it was really about developing deep relationships within the community to make sure that they were addressing the food security issues. So this is one example of asset-based community development that I think is really demonstrates one of your earlier points about how, a solution can grow out of a problem, and it doesn't necessarily need to take, an entity form.
I love that example and your point that it's in this case using the assets that you have at your disposal and not creating something new. How about an example of a fully financially sustainable enterprise?
Yeah, we have one of those actually within our own community, and maybe people have heard about this in the past. Sorry, my slides aren't advancing. There we go. So this was actually, this was a serendipitous type of social entrepreneurial formation. The organizers of this, the founders of this for-profit entity structure didn't set out to solve a literacy issue. So first, to kind of really just focus on the problem for a second, we know that literacy is linked to economic development, to individual and community well-being. We know that we have illiteracy across the world, especially among women, but it's also important to note that we have 21% of our US population who's actually illiterate as well. And so, as I said, the founders of this company didn't set out to address literacy issues. What happened was that they, 3 co-founders, Notre Dame alums, so part of our community here, who were looking for jobs during the tech bubble, and then the bubble burst. What did they do? They had textbooks sitting on their shelves, and it was at the time that Amazon's third-party marketplace opened up, and they said, hey, we need money. So a very entrepreneurial pursuit in terms of, hey, we have textbooks. Maybe if we sell them online, we'll be able to make some money. They were fairly expensive textbooks. And that's really, like I said, serendipitously how Better World Books was born. And the social aspect of this came when they went to Robinson Community Learning Center here in the community. And they said, hey, we want to do a book drive. We want to get more of these textbooks from our friends, but we don't have any place to put them. And so they used the room in the back of the old RCLC. We now have a new RCLC now. And they, and basically they said, to Jay, who was the executive director at the time, said, we'll give you 10% of whatever we receive. And that's really how this social enterprise was born. This was around 2003, 2004. They did decide to set up as a for-profit because they wanted to be able to raise money. They wanted to hire a game theorist to help them with their pricing structure. They knew that they needed to be competitive with the likes of Amazon in order to be able to build this business. And what you see here is an organization that, in less than 2 decades has donated more than 29 billion books across the globe, has raised $31 million for the likes of organizations like RCLC, and reused or recycled 371 million books. In addition, they have carbon offsets. They have more than 400 employees who have, some ownership in the company as well as benefits. And they have recycled other types of things like library shelving, for example.
Well, wonderful success story, and especially with recent news, as we start to question big tech, maybe I should stop buying from Amazon and buy more books from Better World.
That would be good.
Melissa, Pulte and McKenna, and I know you do a lot of work on global development. Mm-hmm. Could you give us a case example of something that's more global?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, all know that access to water is an issue. So again, starting with the problem, 785 million people, 1 in 9, lack access to clean water. And we know that when people have access to clean water, that it improves their security situation, especially in communities. There's increased education, health benefits, economic development. And so there's no shortage of organizations that have been trying to address this problem, and many doing it very innovatively. One such organization was Play Pumps. It still exists, actually. We'll talk about, kind of its current formation in a minute. But basically the idea was, children like to play. And if you set that merry-go-round up with, a water system, and so as the children play and go around, that actually creates energy, and that actually can go to the pump. And so, it was lauded, at the time as a highly innovative opportunity to bring clean water to communities. And both Laura Bush and the Case Foundation invested in this organization. But the interesting thing is that, what they found out was that the cost of the merry-go-round, this play pump, actually costs 4 times more than an actual a water pump. And that when the water pumps broke, no one knew how to fix them, and they were very expensive to fix. And then they also demonstrated, this was written up in The Guardian, that, children would have to play 27 hours a day in order to provide water to this community. So it's not, I don't bring this up as an example to kind of, to take away from what these entrepreneurs really tried to do. They were trying to solve a problem that was very urgent, and it was very innovative what they came up with. But both the entrepreneurs and the Case Foundation said, hey, this isn't actually working. We can't provide this type of, this particular mechanism to a whole community. And they wanted to learn from the things that they were, the shortfalls of the project. So now Play Pumps does still exist, but it's actually trying to provide water to a school versus an entire community. And so that's one example of how, social entrepreneurship is very prevalent in international settings, but we need to, as we're working with communities and, people who are depending on us in communities, or we need to listen to the communities who tell us, there's a reciprocity here, that, there's things that we need to learn, and we need to pivot as social entrepreneurs when we're doing that.
It's a great example of good intentions, but a real downside.
Yeah. Well, Mike, maybe turning it back on you, putting you on the spot again, what are some of the challenges? So I've presented this one about the play pumps in an international context, but what are some of the other challenges associated with social entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so earlier we talked a little bit about the differences between traditional entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, but those differences also bring out certain challenges. And I've tried to distinguish challenges. There are many, but I've picked 6 here, and I've distinguished challenges that exist at the level of the social entrepreneur herself or himself, and also challenges at a more broader level as we try to teach and research and understand social entrepreneurship. So, at the level of the social entrepreneur, one of the big issues is what drives the social entrepreneur is often a passion for the problem, for the issue of hunger or animal abuse or what have you. That passion, though, is not always coupled with an appreciation for or mastery of business capabilities and business skills. And so you end up with a clash between the purity of the heart versus the bottom line. Yeah, but we've got to be successful, we've got to be smart from a management standpoint. You have a lot of stakeholders in these organizations, and they bring conflicting goals and motives. Take Habitat for Humanity as a social entrepreneurship example. If you think about the stakeholders, the people who donate money, the people who donate material, the skilled volunteers, building skills, the employees, the other volunteers, the neighbors where a home is going to be built, the larger community, the poor or those who cannot afford a home and might get one through Habitat, or local government that provides permits. These different stakeholders have different views on what should be built, what the design should look like, where it should be located, who gets it, at what cost, and how aggressively we should grow Habitat as we try to expand to more home ownership. At the other sort of big challenge at the operational level is sustainable revenue models, because with social initiatives, you're almost always chasing bucks, money, to fuel what you're doing, and hopefully to continue to innovate, and hopefully to continue to grow. And so you need clever and yet disciplined revenue models in terms of what proportion of revenue is coming from donors, or what proportion from grants, what proportions from sponsorships, what proportion from maybe selling t-shirts or some sort of source of revenue. At the broader level, as we saw with your beautiful example of clay pumps, we have to ask the question, is social entrepreneurship inherently good? No matter how pure your intentions are, there are externalities, there are spillovers, there are other effects that are often unintended consequences. Some cases may be more intended. When we talk about social value, the value of a Coca-Cola or a McDonald's hamburger or whatever is one thing reflected in its price, but what should we include when we talk about the amount of value that is being created by this initiative or that social entrepreneurship initiative? What do we include? If you have a campaign against nuclear weapons, what do we include in the value that you're creating through such a campaign? A big issue is, if you start a traditional for-profit venture, you can calculate return on investment pretty straightforwardly. So if people invest in the business, what kind of return do they get over what kind of time period? But when you start talking about social return on investment, it gets a lot more complex and messier, because you're trying to calculate the net present value of benefits received over time and divide by the net present value of the investment. Well, we can figure out the investment, but the net present value of the benefits received, if I look at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, I have to estimate how many lives are saved and what's the value of a life and how much reduced medical and other costs are saved. And so I'm trying to get at, for every dollar invested, what's the dollar value of the benefit? I'm trying to turn social value into dollars. And so if you think about trying to calculate the benefit in dollars from reducing spousal abuse by 5,000 people, or the calculating the benefit of cleaning up the St. Joseph River, reducing pollutants by say 10%, or moving someone from severe poverty to just poverty. The calculation is possible, but it requires a number of assumptions, a number of estimates, a number of leaps. Benefits can take years to realize, and then you've got to factor in those negative externalities that you just talked about. So it can be tough.
It's
Now,
interesting, Mike. One thing that I was just thinking of as you were talking about it is, I think there's also this distinguishing factor between outputs and outcomes. So we can very easily measure the number of people who participated in a program. And like we'll be talking about in a few seconds about one program that you're running, it's not necessarily about the number of people who participated. The real impact, the outcome, is the change in behavior or the change in, a person's business. It's behavioral, or it's an increased health benefit. And as you said, it's difficult to quantify that. And so what we do, we end up focusing on outputs because those are a lot easier to quantify, but social entrepreneurship asks us to do more.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, if I'm looking at healthier eating to reduce diabetes, that might be a little more straightforward to calculate. But if I'm looking at getting people to stop wearing animal fur as part of their clothing, that's a little tougher.
Yeah.
So Melissa, what about Notre Dame? What's Notre Dame doing in this space? What's McKenna and Pulte up to, and what's happening on the campus with social entrepreneurship?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Mike. And first of all, I want to kind of express the fact that we might be talking about what's happening, what you and I are working on, but we want to acknowledge the fact that there's been a lot of social entrepreneurial activities happening across this campus for decades. We want to mention that the Center for Social Concerns has been working on social change with students and with organizations for years. I'm noticing a lot of people on this call, some of people I recognize. Jim Reimer or Elizabeth O'Toole, or I'm calling a few people out here, or Bob Zielsdorf. We've been working.
The Center for Civic Innovation.
Right, exactly. Mendoza, all of our partners across campus have been having some impact for a number of years. So I want to make sure that we acknowledge that before we just kind of talk about, what's happening at the Keough School. But since we are talking, we do represent the Keough School and McKenna and the Pulte Institute. One thing that we are doing is trying to formalize social entrepreneurship as an academic discipline. So rather than just a single course or set of activities, we're really trying to become a home for research, creating the case studies. And we're doing events and speaker series, but now we have a minor. And so I think that's a really important component here. I think the other thing to talk about is that, so here I am, you're asking me a question, but really it's you that has created this domestic program in the South Bend community, but it's also been, you talked earlier about scale, not, you don't have to scale, but you're scaling your program on, entrepreneurship and adversity to other cities, working with low-income entrepreneurs, providing mentoring opportunities for them, having our students, it begins and ends with students here at Notre Dame, to be honest, and, getting our students involved in that process. And I love the fact that 65% of the people that are involved in your South Bend community program are women. And I have a feeling this extends well beyond to the other cities that you're working in. I also wanted to mention that we have these international programs. So Department of State has entrusted us with a program with the Mandela Washington Fellowship, which is with our entrepreneurs in the African continent, the Young Leaders of the Americas, which represents Latin America, where we're actually teaching entrepreneurship skills to those fellows. And it's interesting, we had one of our fellows from 2019, Berta, At the beginning of the pandemic, she took those entrepreneurial skills that we had kind of shared, and that process that you talked about earlier, and she created a food delivery business for her community because people were shuttered and weren't able to actually get to the grocery store. So this is an example of how we're kind of expanding. And then finally, talking about student support, wanting to provide opportunities for our students to get experiences in social entrepreneurial organizations, whether it's government, whether it's a not-for-profit, whether it's a for-profit. And, you have a program in South Africa. We partner with the Center for Social Concerns and their ISSLP program. We have a partner, Greg Van Kirk, in Latin America, who takes students. So lots of opportunities here, and as well, again, across the university for students to get involved in social entrepreneurship. So it's pretty exciting work.
What about the new minor, Melissa?
Yeah, so I kind of glossed over the minor, but that's a pretty big thing for us. I think I've been waiting 10 years for that minor, and and I know that you've had the experience with bringing a minor to other campuses on social entrepreneurship, but it's a really exciting opportunity for us. Ray was pivotal in helping and Dean Appleby was pivotal in bringing that to the Keough School. So new minor, new opportunities. We're partnering with colleges across the campus in order to bring students these courses, and to really help them understand that it doesn't matter what your discipline is. You can be an engineer, you can be a political scientist, you can be a business student, and you can still study social entrepreneurship and apply it back to your discipline, back to the problems that you're studying in your discipline, and look for innovative solutions there. So it's a really exciting opportunity, and really happy to be able to share it with our alumni community.
It is exciting, and I'll apologize for dating myself, but to quote the title of an old Carpenter song, we've only just begun. A lot of exciting possibilities ahead.
Well, that's why we have 2 more weeks of, talking about what's going on with social entrepreneurship. But I think we've probably hit our time here. And so I'm going to pass it over to Ray to close this up here.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike and Melissa, for that great discussion. And I know how enthusiastic you are about this program and building it. So I'm sure we could continue on the subject for a lot longer. But I think it's a time when we actually want to open the conversation up for questions from our viewers online. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'd like to invite each of you to use the chat function where there is a link where you can ask a question. So, it'll probably pop up on your screen momentarily. So, take the opportunity to, there it is, take the opportunity to just hit that link and it'll open up and you can pose a question for Mike and Melissa. In the meantime, as you kind of put your thoughts together and put some questions forward, I think what I'm going to do is jump in with a few. We had a few that were submitted earlier that I can maybe get us going with. So the first one actually is, we hear a lot about failure rates oftentimes when we're talking about entrepreneurship. You often hear that, within the restaurant industry, X number of restaurants started and maybe you have an 80% failure rate, something like that, or and similarly for other kinds of enterprises. And what's the experience for social entrepreneurs? Is there a similar rate of failure, and how would you compare that to the for-profit, not-for-profit failure rates, and maybe talk a little bit about what often is the case for why these efforts fail?
Yeah, Ray, it's an important question. I guess I'd start by saying the issue of failure is way overemphasized. I think that you hear people say things like, well, 98% of startups fail. It's not nearly that bad. The failure rates approximate between 45 and 55%, which is still high, but it's not 98. And as you said, those rates vary significantly by sector, and so your restaurants do have a meaningfully higher failure rate than say somebody that's doing plastics extrusion or something. in the social entrepreneurship space, we just don't have good data. The kind of information and some of it's definitional. What do we count as a social entrepreneurship initiative or venture? Some of them are not organization based. Some of them are in existing organizations, as Melissa was giving us some examples of. But what we do know is those failure rates are rising, and some of that is because we're seeing record numbers of new social enterprises started, of new nonprofits started with a social purpose, and so there's more competition for resources. Other issues are some of those questions we raised at the back end, the challenge of a sustainable revenue model, the challenge of bringing in, managerial competence as well as passion for the social cause.
I think one thing that I'd like to add as well is that, sometimes in social entrepreneurship, even though there are failure rates, sometimes social entrepreneurs don't want to accept failure. If there's a passion and there's a community that you're trying to, provide a service for, or a community that you're working with. And so there's a lot more pressure. It's not to say that, traditional entrepreneurs don't feel that pressure, but there's a lot of pressure in terms of making sure that this works. And so sometimes there might be, we might stick it out when there are signs to tell us that we shouldn't, or, there's just this kind of relentlessness among, these social entrepreneurs, these individuals in these organizations that say, we have to figure this out.
Well, Ray, as well, just to pick up a big issue right now, we look at a business like GameStop, why its stock price might have nothing to do with its actual value. It has profit indicators that tell it it's failing or it's not failing. The nonprofit doesn't have the same kind of indicators, and so you may be too far gone by the time you really realize that you're failing.
Great. Well, let me, I have a great follow-up question for you that I think speaks to some of the things you were talking about. So this question goes as follows. So how do you advise funders to evaluate the effectiveness of an organization when the outputs or outcomes are soft? And on the flip side, how do you advise organizations to pursue funding when the outcomes are soft or longer term beyond the duration of the grant?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll take a stab at that, Mike, and then, I'll let you follow up. On the funder side, where they're looking at an organization that might have soft outputs or outcomes. First of all, outputs aren't necessarily soft, right? You've got some hard numbers associated with those outputs. The question is, what's the impact associated with that activity? And I would say that, we need to be asking organizations to provide that data. And if that data isn't coming through, then, it's not to say that the organization isn't doing the work, but maybe they need, the assistance in putting that data together, or maybe they need, funding to gather that data, or a partner or a university partner who can help them gather that data. So I think I don't want to presume that the organization is relying upon anecdotal evidence or anecdotes to kind of, move forward. But I think there is this tension that we need evidence, we need data, but nonprofit organizations especially don't have the funding mechanisms or sometimes the expertise to really kind of push on that evidence. Mike, what do you think?
Well, I think the issue that we talked about a little earlier on estimating social return on investment is critical. And there are techniques and there are approaches. They are based on assumptions, and the data may not be as clean and precise as one wants. But As an example, Ray, Stanford has a resource to help people calculate social return on investment. There are others as well. So I wouldn't give up the ghost on the ability to do that. At the same time, I think in building on what Melissa said, it's key that people pursuing social entrepreneurship, whether it's through an entity or community action or that it be goal driven and that those goals be quantified to the extent possible. And so if I'm trying to reduce drunk driving, then by how many fewer drunk driving arrests this year, or trying to find tangible goal indicators, metrics.
So,
And one more thing that I wanted to add, I think there's a tension, with the funding community too. Solving, social problems take some time to solve. Obviously we haven't, we have a lot of problems that we haven't solved. And so we do need to drive impact. But there's it's, the funder, the investor kind of mentality of, hey, it takes 3 to 5 years to kind of make, generate a profit and make, return on investment isn't the same in a, with a social entrepreneurial enterprise or organization. And so there has to be there's different criteria that we need to use as well from a funding perspective when we're looking at impact. It might not be there at 3 years. It might take 5 to 7 years before we begin to see it play out. So that's just something that I would add.
So this maybe this follows a little bit on this part of the conversation, where just building a little bit off the idea that good intentions may not be enough of a basis for defining a social enterprise, for example, or who's a social entrepreneur. Who defines, in fact, a social entrepreneur? Do we define ourselves, others, or is it largely based on impact? And perhaps what mechanisms should entrepreneurs have to ensure that their work is truly social?
Well, I think it starts with a clear sense of the problem I'm trying to address, and setting boundaries or parameters around what aspect of that problem I'm attempting to address. And so I think most problems, social problems, and I know, Ray, you've had tremendous experience in this space, but lend themselves to certain kinds of metrics. They may be proxy or more indicators, but I think it has to start there in terms of a clear sense of some kind of performance assessment. It certainly could be argued that many churches are involved in providing social benefits, but what we're focused on more is value that's being created to address the social problem, not put a Band-Aid on it, but resolve it. Not just help the poor maintain, but provide a pathway out of poverty, as a case in point.
Maybe building off of that is, there's a great MIT, kind of article that was written some years back that talks about, are we trying to solve the right problems? And it doesn't mean, are we trying to solve the right social problems? It's more about, what companies are we starting if we're starting a company, or what organizations are we starting, or are we partnering with organizations? So for example, do we need, and this was direct quote from the article or paraphrase from the article, do we need another food app, to help us get our food? We have lots of problems in our communities, and, we need to be, more thoughtful, more intentional about solving them. And I think that's one measure. And I think the other measure, and I asked Mike this question earlier, kind of in a, and it was somewhat serious, is all entrepreneurship social? Because as I was saying, if we're truly solving the right problems, then it does become social entrepreneurship, because we're addressing issues that people need addressed, transportation issues, food issues, not better food, not how to get my food faster, but just, food security. That's when it gets really kind of fuzzy in the middle. And that's good when it's less, when you can't really kind of, describe it, in a very concrete way. I think that's when social entrepreneurship is taking place.
Well, and as the examples we saw in today in the discussion, if you take Tom's shoes as an example, we'll give a pair of shoes away for every pair of shoes we sell. There's more recent evidence that those free shoes may not have created as much value as one might otherwise have believed. And so having this clear sense of a social value proposition and realizing that there are external aspects of what you do that could suggest the amount of value you're creating is less is important.
I think I was reflecting as you were talking about the Grameen Bank and it's the way it approaches poverty at the village level, where the way you have to measure poverty is really in terms of it's very unique and very context specific. And they developed this poverty index for looking at poverty, where literally it varies by country and varies by the sort of the rural conditions in the context in which you're looking. So I think probably what we want to emphasize, particularly as you're setting a baseline, as Mike discussed, is you need to be thinking about where you are and what's the particular set of indices that are appropriate for that context as your starting point, and then you can sort of build from there. We have time for one more question, and I think this is one you can both probably answer in some detail. What role do you see Notre Dame alumni playing in support of the university's social enterprise efforts?
I'd love to jump in on that one. A ton.
I thought you would.
First of all, there's probably a lot of entrepreneurial activity that's taking place that we have no idea of. And I think it would be, we want to be able to provide students with opportunities to be mentored, to be interning for entrepreneurs or organizations that are involved in socially entrepreneurial efforts. And so I think, both, letting us know if you want to participate, work with us on our programming, but also providing us with, organizations that we can, have students affiliated with is a great opportunity. I mean, I see some people on this here that I may have taught a couple of years back who I know are, kind of doing the work now, but there's so many alums that we know are doing this work, but we don't have a direct connection to. So I would love for them to reach out and so that we can figure that out. Mike, I'm sure you've got some thoughts too.
Well, it's a great tee up, Ray, because next week we're going to talk about poverty and entrepreneurial approaches to addressing poverty, and so we'll get into that in more detail. But as we try to expand our poverty and entrepreneurship initiative, not just to more American cities, but to cities around the globe, I think there are lots of roles for alums in terms of as volunteers, as mentors, and other kind of roles that they could play.
Great. Listen, I want to thank you both for packing a lot of information into a very short amount of time, and providing, I think, sort of the framework we'll need as we kind of advance through the next conversations over the coming week, or weeks, I should say. And I want to turn to our audience, and I want to thank you all for participating in this discussion. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. But as I said at the beginning, you now have an option to join a community breakout room for 15 minutes and continue the discussion with your peers, as well as our faculty leads. So please note that if you choose not to participate in the breakout rooms, you can leave the meeting now, or and of course join us next week. If you plan to stay for the breakout rooms, which will be automatically assigned, I want to invite you to introduce yourselves in those rooms, share your location, where you're sitting on the globe, and if you're comfortable, perhaps your occupation and your university affiliation. And once you've introduced yourselves, I'd just like to suggest you begin to talk about the discussion. And I'm just going to offer 2 questions you might consider as I suppose you might say, warm-up questions to get the conversation going. One might be, did your perceptions of social entrepreneurship change based on what we've just learned and we've discussed during the course of the last hour? And how does social entrepreneurship apply to your own personal and professional life? Some of you may be social entrepreneurs or considering dedicating a portion of your life to that kind of activity.